I think yesterday there was a similar panel talking about business model and financing, but it was really focused more on, or at least the title was on, standalone systems. And my takeaway from that discussion is that it's still a very broad market. I think people talk about standalone systems and microgrids, and somebody in the last panel said nanogrids, and we're supposed to talk about mini grids. I think we're all sort of talking about the same space, because I don't know if we can really come up with a great definition as to what is a mini grid. So some would say it's a combination of power generation and distribution at low voltage to a small set of customers. But this is very simplistic, and I think many of you here in the room, as well as others, would agree there really is no off-the-shelf solution for a microgrid or a mini grid. You're always going to have a system being designed to meet sort of the needs of the customers that you're trying to serve or the country you're trying to work in. And so everything is going to be done on a bespoke basis. So you're going to have so many variables affecting or classifying your mini grid, and this could be the size of the system. Is it a 10 kilowatt system? Is it a 100 kilowatt system? You're also going to have differences just in the source of generation. We know that there's going to be some diesel and some battery for at least for backup purposes, but some may be solar mini grids, some may be biomass mini grids, micro hydro. The technical considerations is also going to vary the types of mini grids that you might be looking to do. And what sort of service is it? In the last panel, we had somebody from Miragal that was talking about he's providing basically two lights and a mobile phone charger. Other mini grids might be 24-hour grid replacement. And then there's also the in-between where somebody is just trying to do sort of a supplement for load shedding periods. So these are the sorts of things about how mini grids vary, and I think all of you probably have a different idea in your mind as to what type of mini grid you're thinking about. And I think the idea is here from this panel is we're going to try to speak about our experiences working on mini grids and business models and try to narrow down these parameters and try to explain to you how these systems were designed for their particular markets. So I think we had a quick discussion yesterday to talk about what we're going to talk about today. I think all the panelists up here sort of agree that it's really, really important to remember that this is not a mature market. This is not even close to being a mature market. There is, like I said, so many variables, but at this early stage of development, the only thing that we can give you at this point is just a snapshot to say what are we seeing in which countries and with what private sector entrepreneurs and what they're doing. And hopefully that will help impart some lessons, unlock some of the knowledge that the panelists have on their clients and on their beneficiaries that they're working with. So with those sort of introductory remarks, the panelists and I have agreed that we're going to effectively have 2 rounds of quick discussions. We're going to try to keep them limited. We're going to first talk about business models. And that should include a discussion of what is a business model. So we know what we're talking about. And once we go through 1 round of comments about business models, then we'll do another round where we talk about how is the financing being used to either complement or address the business model. So we're going to try to break this up. I've asked the panelists to be as concrete and specific as they can in terms of experiences on the ground with clients in countries actually doing mini grids so that we can focus this conversation as much as possible for your benefit. So there are five excellent people up here besides me, and I'm going to let them do most of the talking. My job now is I'm just the midfield center. I'm going to try to distribute the ball as best I can and keep the time where it needs to be. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and with that, I will distribute the football to Sandeep for the first set of comments.
Thanks. My name is Sandeep Giri. I'm the CEO of GAM Power. We're a solar project developer and EPC company based in Nepal, mostly focusing on commercial solar as well as microgrids in rural areas. My background is actually in the IT industry. For a long time, I've been running software companies in the San Francisco Bay Area. And after about 15, 20 years of doing that, I moved back to my native country, Nepal, to start GAM Power so that we could use renewable energy as a way to address the power crisis that's in Nepal, which people experience in many forms, shapes and sizes. Actually, in urban areas, it's as bad as 16 plus hours of daily load shedding, no power. So for us, it was important to look at that and say, when all these industries and even households, they're using things like diesel generator or batteries and car batteries and stuff like that to address with the energy crisis, can we make solar available at reasonable prices, prices better than diesel, and go after that market? So that's how we started the company, and today we're about 30 plus people in Nepal. We've done over 400 projects of all different shapes and sizes, small home systems to larger systems at US Embassy and UNICEF buildings, places like that. Very rural systems, like we have systems in very close to Mount Everest Base Camp, different areas. So, and we're here to share our experiences with, especially around microgrids, so we can share and also learn from you.
I'm Anu. I'm with Bamboo Finance. We are a private equity that invests in companies which through their products or services directly benefit low-income communities. In short, we are an impact investor, and through this fund, we've invested in several energy companies, actually 5. One of them selling solar lanterns, the other selling solar lanterns and solar home systems, another mini grid operator, and finally another company that supplies LPGs to rural health centers. So we are present across the energy spectrum, and I'm here to share our views on this.
My name is Markus Wiemann. I'm Secretary General of the Alliance for Rural Electrification. I have the pleasure to be in this session because I think that the mini-grids are certainly the major technology which will help us to achieve universal energy access, which is the main mission of the IRES. So there's, out of 80, 90 members, there are about 20, 25 active in the field of mini-grids. And what we would like to achieve in general is, first of all, a better sensibilization about the mini-grids, about the technical aspects, about the financing, and what we have done in that regard. And we do that together with a number of actors. It's together also with Tripta, who represents here the United Nations Foundation that we launched at the C4All Forum just 1-2 weeks ago in New York, an HIO, which is a high-impact opportunity to raise, a better understanding on mini-grids and also better financing access. This is why we are sitting here. And let me close with this now. So first introduction round. Thank you.
I wish I hadn't used that football analogy because I'm fumbling the ball. Tripta?
Thank you. So thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much to the organizers for this opportunity. I'm Tripta Singh. I'm the Director for Energy Access at the UN Foundation. For those of you that don't know the United Nations Foundation, it's a not-for-profit that's registered in Washington, D.C. and was started in 1998 when Ted Turner gave $1 billion to the United Nations on behalf of the US government. So we no longer are a grant-making organization, but we support UN causes and work closely with the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. And as part of a contribution to that initiative, we run something called the Energy Access Practitioners Network, which is which has about 1,600 individuals that are members of it, representing 191 countries and focusing mainly on off-grid and mini-grid solutions to energy access. And so this session, mini-grids is a very big area of interest for our membership, and we have a very strong community that meets regularly to talk about best practices and knowledge sharing in this area. So this session is of great interest to us.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for giving us this opportunity. My name is Santosh Singh, and I work for GIZ India. For those who are not aware of GIZ, we are a German government-owned enterprise implementing development cooperation projects across almost more than 130 countries. And in India, we are implementing a bilateral project, which is co-financed by Government of India and Government of Germany. I work with Indo-German Energy Program, and our mandate for this program is that we are looking to develop sustainable business models for providing clean energy in rural areas, And under this mandate, mini grids are a very critical part of our focus because we believe that mini grids are, the potentials for solving some of the energy problems in most rural areas. We have been working with a number of state governments in India, and I would be sharing our experiences of working with the state governments and several private developers who are, working with us to develop a business model. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, now that everybody knows everybody's name, now the question is, what is a business model? What does it really mean? So I'm going to let Sandeep start first again.
Well, that's a heavy question. What's the business model? Well, I don't think there is a business model of any kind. Even the name itself is confusing. If you go to GAM Power's website, we talk about microgrids. When I came to this conference, it's about mini grids, and I have a question: am I a microgrid or am I a mini grid? What are we really doing? So the names can get a little bit confusing. So I think it's important to realize that there is not just one single business model. I like to look at it from the perspective of a business trying to solve a problem in a sustainable way. That's where we start. So the whole idea of having a mini grid or a microgrid is that instead of having a single rooftop solar solution, you're having some sort of a centralized power plant, whether even it's a small 1-2 kilowatt, or if it's, in fact, I was at the other session earlier, in Bangladesh, the mini grid plan goes up to 7 megawatt. So if you look at a 7 megawatt, is that a system, is that still qualify as a mini grid? Well, in Bangladesh it does, and I'm sure they have reasons to call it that way. So my point here is that there's all these different variables, but the business model starts not at the name, not at the size. It starts from solving the solution, solving the problem. And the problem we're looking at is that communities where just having a single rooftop solution in terms of solar is not enough. There is a need to connect multiple households, businesses, et cetera, with using a transmission line, even if that's 100 meters long. So that's where you start. And then before we can even talk technology, it's all about looking at, is it a viable solution? We're looking at basic things like what's your cost of production, what's the purchase capability of the local community. If it's not good enough, where are you going to get the gap funding? So all those basic, boring business constructs come into play when you're building the business model. And only once you have that, then you look at what technology is suitable for that place. I mean, in Nepal, there's wonderful examples of mini-grids using microhydro. And then there are places where microhydro is not sustainable because there's no river nearby or no easy way to do any transmission. So in those cases, you may look at, okay, if there's good solar radiation there, so you can perhaps use solar. Or maybe there's good enough biogas in that business community. So I think sometimes we, as entrepreneurs, fall in love with our business idea or technology, and that could be dangerous because we always have to look at it from the perspective of the customer, and which in this case is not just one person, but it's a community. And that's whose perspective you have to understand in order to build a business model. Now, in terms of specific components of the business model, I think some of the things that we said earlier come into play, which is once you've identified the technology, right, it's very important to get the costing done right so that you got to do your homework all around to make sure that you are choosing the right technology in terms of the cost, because these are places where the payment capacity is not that high, right? The other thing is, which in our experience has worked, is that we focused on areas where we were certain there were at least 2 to 3 businesses in that community. So if we're looking at a village, we want to make sure there are at least 2 to 3 villages who would be using the majority of the load or the capacity of the system, and then only go to individual households. Why do we do that? Because we're not sure. Because we're not sure. There isn't an existing mechanism where the individual households or existing data points of what the existing households will pay. The only thing we have to compare against is solar home systems, which has a completely different business model. So in our case, we decided to focus more on identifying specific businesses, whether it's a rice mill or a dairy chilling center. And sometimes we even have to go and help build a business. Look at the opportunity, and sometimes our project development looks like actually business development, where our staff is going to the community, sitting down with the community leaders or interested entrepreneurs in that community and say, hey, you know what, if I come and put a rice mill here, will you run it? How much rice will you get? Who will come? Who will buy? What will they pay you per kilogram? Stuff like that, which has nothing to do with solar. But if we don't do that, we don't have a solar mini-grid or a system either. So it's that level of sort of working out in the beginning that has to go in place so that you have a very clear picture of the financials of the system. What's your cost of production? Who's going to pay for it? Who are your major customers? And then we come into financing, which I think we're going to talk in our next round. So I hope that helps answer some parts of that question.
Before I let you off the hook, I'm going to do this to all five of you. It's a great description of your model, but what was the one thing, if you have to pick one thing, what was the hardest thing to overcome or the hardest thing that you still have not overcome with your business model?
Wow. I'm not sure if it's the one. Well, there's a couple things. One, with the business model, because we're going into areas where there isn't an existing load, everything is hypothetical, right? You're going in there and saying, well, I know this place, I know human condition where there's a desire to prosper, to have things, to eat better, or have access to multiple services. Based on that belief, we're saying that, okay, if we help, let's say put a rice mill, or if we help provide telemedicine-related services, that will generate revenue because it's happened in other places. Has it happened in that village? I have no idea. Has it happened in other villages like that? I've heard of it, but we haven't seen right there. So I think you're putting a lot of faith in that. And that's why for financing, you kind of look more than just looking at private investors to share some of that risk. Because these are, I think at this point, at least in Nepal, there is a higher amount of risk in these projects. So I think that's probably the biggest part that comes to me.
That's great. And that's even some of ADB's experience we've seen where we don't really know what the demand curve looks like. When the power comes in, what we've heard is that you have an exponential growth because you don't actually know who is going to be taking up that load, and then how can you also scale your supply to deal with those load requirements as you go along? Because you can't tell your new customers, well, okay, we only have this much, and we have to wait longer to put more on the system. So that's excellent. Thank you. Okay, Anu, same questions.
As an investor, we are very excited about mini grids, and the reason is that it gives the scope of 24 hours electricity, which is closest to considering full electrification, right? So at the same time, from whatever we've seen, we look at mini grids, especially in off-grid locations, as a business that has all the challenges of a utility as well as the challenges of a social enterprise, which is what makes it very difficult or tough to operate. What this means, let me share the experience of Ask Power, one of our portfolio company in which we are investors since 2010. So Husk operates biomass power plants, single fuel. So that's rice husk is the only fuel it uses, no diesel backup, and 32 kilowatt size, and it connects 200 to 300 households using that 32 kilowatt system. They set up 80 power plants since 2006. Now we are operating about 55 power plants, so something slightly about 60% of the plants. Why is this situation, and what is the scenario for Aspa today is that it's going through a painful but a necessary transition. What we have learned is that mini grids, though it's an ideal solution for rural electrification or complete electrification, it's not for every market. This is something that even Nico touched upon in the previous session. You have to understand that it's only for certain villages with certain consumption level, or certain households or certain regions. So that's the utility challenge coming into play. Because of size, you have to you can only cover a certain area, and you have to have a customer base. Then comes the social enterprise challenge. Because you're operating in off-grid locations, invariably majority of your customers are low income with not a stable revenue stream, which means their payment patterns might also vary. They may not consistently pay you, which is a challenge you have to also understand. So when you place a power plant, when you enter a market, you have to understand what is your electricity being used for. Is it a consumption? Something that people can choose or decide whether they want or not want, or is it an asset that is generating revenue? So it is critical to have it and ensure the payment continues. So this is just one aspect of how the utility and the social enterprise challenge translates to us. The other issue that Ask Power had was in terms of scale. When they set up 20, it was beautifully streamlined and they were able to expand to 40. When they went from 40 to 80, everything collapsed. One aspect is definitely, yes, we can bring in more operational efficiency in the way how the systems are scaled, how the company operates. But the other bigger challenge is in monitoring and supervising, especially the cash collections. This is the social enterprise challenge. Because you're operating in off-grid locations, you have to work with people who may not be completely qualified. So you have to take the training costs, and you also have to bear the costs of losses, thefts, even pilferage of cash by your own employees. So these kind of aspects you have to solve for. For a while, these were challenges, but then solutions emerged in India, in Africa, on pay-as-you-go solution that completely did away with manual cash collections. Today we are looking to integrate those solutions, but these are, again, when we look at technological solutions, they are standardized. Right? So you have to now look at the cost of customizing it for your systems. That's another utility or technology level solution. The third challenge we have is now we are at a place where we've realized that as a single enterprise, we cannot operate multiple decentralized entities. So the solution is to franchise or go from a utility service model to a product company. So we sell the mini grid as a package to a rural entrepreneur. We are able to do this thanks to capital subsidies from the government that allows a rural entrepreneur to invest, and also the presence of banks that finance the other portion of the cost of the system. However, there's also the challenge that when you work with governments and even banks, there is a delay. So your sales is dependent on having the presence of these entities. And this is the social enterprise challenge. You're working in a market where infrastructure doesn't exist. I love to quote the example of Solar City in the US. They started with, so it's not a mini grid, but a solar home system. And Sandeep's also been doing solar home systems. And there are several. But the very fact that they operate in a country like United States, where you have access to credit scores, where you have access to consumer finance, where you have access to working capital finance for your own enterprise, the possibility of scale up, the way they have scaled up is very different from enterprises working in the developing countries doing the same business and doing the same model. Because you're in the social enterprise space, you have to solve for the financial issues, the lack of these infrastructure yourself, which adds to the cost of your operations. Given all these challenges, is it even possible for an enterprise to function in a way that private investors can invest and generate returns, both for sustaining the business and for attracting future investors like us? We still believe and are confident that it's possible, and that's why we are also setting up another fund exclusively focused on energy access. This is a Solar for All fund, and a part of that fund will be for investing in mini grids and microgrids, because we've seen entrepreneurs creatively solve these for the solutions, and we also believe return is possible. But there is a clear need to recognize what risks, what challenges, and what time frame for investment are we looking at.
Yeah, let me add upon these very nice elaborations already. That was very comprehensive. What I would like to add is also that as a business association, of course, we believe in mini-grids, but only if market developments allow for this, when the means are there that private actors can act in this field. And so there's a clear understanding from our members that they want to go to the market in a reason, or when we are looking now into the situation, what makes a mini-grid business model successful? I mean, in the end, a business model is successful if there is enough interest from actors engaged in the market. When it's, as you said earlier, if it's not if it's in an early phase, obviously it's a development market where a number of additional actors need to be active, including the public sector. And so before an investor from the private side and also from the public side will engage, I think a number of circumstances need to be clarified. So this is what I wanted to express earlier with this high impact opportunity, that we want to first help to establish the regulatory frameworks. We want to establish the policy frameworks, which is first a long-term stability to a market. Also then, I think it's very important that the public sector still needs to pour in some, donor money, while at the same time we need to educate on the actors in the field that they develop business models which allow for lower co-financing in the future. So there needs to be some innovation. So certainly the business sector itself needs to do a bit more on its side. But when I look into the key recommendations of IOREC 1 happening 2 years ago in Ghana, and I read into especially on those recommendations dedicated on mini-grids, I think we are still in a situation that we have not found the solution on all these recommendations made there. So we said there, if I may just repeat, what is necessary: use of public resources to leverage private sector investment, which was the first point mentioned. Coordination of different financial resources, I think this is still needed. Investment in public infrastructure and other non-generating assets, all this is still needed. Adequate institutional mechanism and efficient administrative procedures, also still needed. The coordination between rural electrification and programs and initiatives, this is what we try with this HIO. Provision of customized, long-term, affordable and finance to support that enterprises get engaged here. I think it's still needed. And what we speak about, it's the design of financing schemes targeted to mini-grids. Of course, there's still a need to learn more. So what I want to say is that there's certainly, when I see how we engage on a global basis with our members through the networks we have, that there is a higher interest from the private sector to get engaged, but a number of lessons need still to be learned. So what makes a business model successful? I think we need to look into opportunity costs. So why should a company engage in mini-grids if they make more money in grids which are heavily subsidized, for example? So what makes a company invest in a market where it's not really clear what is the outcome, what is the exit? There are very few examples so far where we have positive results on an exit strategy after investing. So all this needs to be kept in mind. I mean, we are speaking about investments which are not only a one-year investment. Normally we want to maintain a market, we want to grow the market, so all this needs to be clarified. And I think with the points mentioned earlier, I think there still needs a lot of things to be done. I would like to make use of the opportunity here also to, of course, to invite to this high-impact opportunity to join it with the experience you have. There might be a number of mini-grid operators, project developers, financiers who could bring in some competence, because I think a very important point is also that we need to share the good news. If there are good examples that we just heard, I mean, it's not necessary, not enough if we just have them in one country. Why not sharing them directly in other occasions? This is why we have IOREC, this is why ARA was established. And so I really would like to invite you to join the HIO, to join also ARA in a way, to bring in your expertise, because the business models which are right now there, I think they are in a developing stage, in dependence on, the framework conditions which are just, not yet sufficient from an alliance, from an association's perspective.
Okay, thanks. That was a good comment also about thinking about the demonstration that we actually need to see of systems in use. And I'm under no obligation to do this, but I'm going to plug just somebody that happened to mention that if you'd like to see a system of a mini grid in use, there actually is a biomass system from All Power Labs that's in the back of our loading dock, and you can go see a biomass gasifier in operation if you'd like to see that. So we still have to remember this is talking about the technology and the actual equipment and what actually works to develop and operate a mini grid. But I'll keep trying to bring it back to the business model discussion, and I'll give it to Tripta now.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I agree with Sandeep and Anu in the way that they characterize the business model. Somewhat simplistically, I think of a business model as a construct that brings different components together in a way that that business can run in a long-term sustainable manner. So that could look different for different regions, for different technologies. And we published, earlier this year, we published a report on successful business models which had 7 case studies. And there's one case study that I really, I mean, I like the other ones too, but there's one case study that I would like to share with you, which is from the Malaysia, the Borneo region in Malaysia. And this is, Anu talked about Hus Power, and Sandeep talked about Gam Power, and this is a little bit different in the sense that this business model used mini grids basically as a way to empower and organize the community in that region. So what it did was that it brought, there are the 3 NGOs, where there's one which is called Green Empowerment, which is based in Oregon, United States. The other one is called Tonibang, which is from that region, from the Borneo region in Malaysia. And then there's a third one, which is an association of community organizations that's from that region as well. And the way they function is that they come together with their different skills. So Green Empowerment works primarily on, it works with partners in developing countries to promote rural electrification. Tonibang works on micro hydro technologies and on community empowerment. And the third, the Community Association Partnership, works to train communities in skills that they need to maintain these systems. And so the way it works is that these 3, Tonibang and Green Empowerment, are the channels through which financing is raised for installing these microgrids in those areas. And together they have done about 15 microgrids so far, and since 2000. And so they are the ones that raise funding, and if a village is interested in being connected with to a microgrid, the village can approach any one of these 3 organizations, and then the organizations will raise funding, and then once the microgrid is, or mini grid, I'm using them interchangeably, once that is installed and has finished 1 year of operation, after that they hand it over to the community, and then the community has ownership of that mini grid. And so the community, once it gets ownership of the mini grid, it creates a village level committee, which has the village headman, 2 to 7 operators, depending on the size of the mini grid, and other volunteers. And the requirement for a village to be connected to the mini grid is that the village community has to provide in-kind services. So they have to provide labor or volunteer for some of the activities. And so, and it's up to the village committee to set up tariffs for that service. And the tariffs are used mainly for O&M. They are set up as a fund, which is used mainly for operations and maintenance in case repairs are needed. And because this is a micro hydro mini grid, then the operation costs are not really that high. And so the tariffs, in most cases, unless the damage to the microgrid in case of a landslide or something like that is not very large, in a lot of cases the tariffs are sufficient to make those repairs. So this is a really good example, and it has worked so far in the sense that most of the mini grids are still running. The only one that, of the 15, there was one that stopped running for a period of time, and that was due to a heavy landslide situation. And that's and that's where one of the challenges also comes in this model, is that these mini grids are not registered with the government. And so the only source of funding that they have for any type of repairs is what the community pays as tariffs. So in situations where the cost of repair is high, they are not able to make those repairs. So if there is some support from the government, or if they work with the government to collaboratively, then there's a possibility that the government might pitch in. So and we can talk about this a little bit more in detail later, probably. But I just wanted to mention this for now.
Great, that's excellent. It's a very different type of business model than what we've talked about so far. So we're getting a nice cross-section of experiences. Santosh, you want to talk about what GIZ is doing?
So, as I mentioned, that we are a support organization, we provide support to the sector. And in ideal scenario, if the two people there at that side of the panel is living happily with each other, so business models work and the financiers are happy with the business models, we don't have rest of the panel's relevance. So, what I would like to highlight, I will take from the definition that Tripta gave, that business model as a construct which makes businesses solve the problem sustainably on some front. I would try to open the construct and see like what all elements come together in that, and that would really make a bit more specific discussion on the business model. So I have been listening to the earlier panel and was noting down certain keywords that were thrown on the business models, and I just looked at my notebook. It's half filled. I'm just talking about the variables. I'll just read out and then I'll tell you what GIZ is doing there. So the variables that I noted down and that were critical for viability are technology, size, ownership, whether community, government, mixed, distribution models, payment collection mechanism, demand, consumer needs, capital mix, geographical challenges, policy environment, risk return expectations, reliability of revenue stream, dependence on ancillary support systems, and market segments. And this is just, I might have missed 10 more, right? So it's a huge mix. And not only this, there are different business models described, and there are several variations. So looking at the earlier panel, something that we discussed, I give a few examples of the business model and then try to link to what we are doing. So we heard a business model where Navroj talked about he had asked 20% of the revenue to be kept aside for maintenance. That's another way of looking at it. It's also a part of business model. Then there are business models that we have been worked in past where they only try to serve existing demand in the community. They don't try to look at what demand can be in future or whether they want to unlock demand there. There has been models which are primarily driven by anchor load. So you go and you see an anchor load and you should have a model on that. There are business models where different entities take control of different part of the operation. So somebody taking control of distribution, somebody taking control of payment collection, and somebody taking control of the production. Now, these are so many variables. There are so many variations, and when an entrepreneur looks at this space, he's really confused. If he's a first-time entrepreneur trying to enter the space, he's very confused, and this gives a lot of space for clarity, a lot of space for simplifying things. And we have been working in India with the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy and other state nodal agencies. And we have been looking at this space for quite some time. And I came across an example where one of the state governments in India invited tender for a cluster of villages to be electrified by mini grids. I think only one entrepreneur, only one private sector player bid for that. And ultimately that was scrapped. So we realized that, okay, there's a need, there are technologies, there are business models, there are people ready to finance, there are people ready to get the money, why it's not working. And why we're still struggling about finding out what's the solution. So, we started working on this, and what we thought that can we make a few things clearer there. So we looked at the cluster, and probably my friend Nico talked about briefly in the previous panel. So what we did that we thought, can we take out uncertainties out of this, and make it a bit simpler for the entrepreneurs? So what we did that, we looked at certain variables, can we address those and make it more clearer? So variables like size, consumer needs, capital mix, distribution models, market segments, and reliability of revenue, policy environment, and geographical challenges. We try to take an approach where we try to, can we, understand this from our side, package it together, and then go to the entrepreneur. So, okay, we have already clarified these things for you, so you don't need to go to the field and do the groundwork. We have already solved and put it in a package. And you still retain the control over several operational elements which are critical for your viability. But we have helped you in developing the project because you have much clearer information, much clearer understanding of what challenges we are facing. So we are working on that, and we are trying to develop a model. If that works, then probably what we are trying to say is that there will be one step that you define the problem, provide the variables in much more clearer view to the entrepreneurs, and then ask them to set up. So as an entrepreneur, as a financer, you are much more clear about what you are stepping into, rather than going there and figuring out what we have stepped into. A good example would be when Anu invested in Husk Power. She would have never thought that she is going to try out a franchisee model. At that time, there was no question of that, right? When somebody invested in Desi Power, some time back, they never thought that they are going to have challenges about, how micro enterprise would be developed and whether that would become much critical for success of Desi Power rather than power production. Now, so one thing that we have learned so far is that the business model in mini-grid is a kind of evolutionary concept. It's not that you go with a fixed model and say this will work. You solve problems and your business model evolves. And this has a few learnings for us, because when we go for a fixed template to assess an enterprise, you are completely ignoring the evolutionary aspect of the business model. How can you assess which is yet to evolve? So can we have that approach that we go to assess a business model, then we have that approach in mind that I am sure about 60-70%, but this 30-40% of this whole thing will evolve. And as a institution financing, as an institution providing support, I should be ready to take care of that 40. I think it's a very good approach for Anu to say that, okay, we invested in something, but we are with you and we'll support you how the model evolves. So this is something that, and GIZ has been working with a number of partners to try to address sort of variables. So we are not saying that the one entity can solve all the problems, but it's good for all the three to come together and try to solve problems and then see what business model applies. So get the clarity beforehand if you can get, rather than deciding a model and going there.
Thank you. I think that's really excellent. And I think that's a good sort of turning point for us to talk about our second topic, which is about financing. As ADB, I'm a lender. I'm going to be looking at projects like this and whether I want to lend to a private sector entrepreneur that's doing a mini-grid. So when we talk about all these variables, as a lender, all I see is more due diligence. I have to do more and more due diligence on this project. I have more and more risk that I have to do. So right now, I'm very skeptical. Well, why would I want to do these projects? So we have this financing gap that we need to solve, and I'd like to now ask the panel to think, how is it that we can get comfortable around these risks, or how can you do some sort of an innovative type of financing so that a typical lender approach, like I just described, is not what we take forward in terms of financing mini-grids? What's the next step of innovation on the finance side? And I think I'd like to, based on Santosh's prompt, I'm going to start with Anu on this question.
Thank you, Don. I'll start by saying you should invest in us. We'll take care of the due diligence and all your headaches. So, yes, but that's an important point I'd like to establish. So investors like us who are much more familiar and comfortable with the smaller size and the business, the issues and the risks, because we are aware as investors, and especially not just investors in the energy space, we are investors across, multi-sector investors in the social space. So we can draw lessons from what's happening in the healthcare space, in education, in water, which are also service-led, community-led business models. So our presence in this space and also in the microfinance industry has helped us have knowledge about what are the models you could, what which way a company, evaluate and say the process that a company is moving towards, or the way the company is operating, their views, the management's track record, and their view on how their business will grow, what is the basis for this, whether that will work or not, or whether it is very much off the ground. This has helped us assess several business, and that's one of the key aspects that gives us the confidence to raise a fund exclusively focusing on energy access. So look at us as investors. In terms of our financing of companies, we've not really been that creative with any special financing instruments. We provide plain equity investments, and with all kind of terms and conditions that a private equity investor or even a late venture stage investor would expect. So nothing different from there. But only variation we have done is we've used convertible structures where we have had issues agreeing on valuation with the investor, with the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur's expectation of valuation and our expectation of valuation, wherever it has differed, we have said, let's then push it to the future and linked it to performance milestones. So that's the only difference. But this, again, in the impact investment space has become quite a common investment structure. So other than this, we've not done anything special on financing. And I'd just like to reinforce by saying that our belief and our strength in the sector, despite what Marcus pointed out of not having clear exits, which is important for us as a private equity investor, because that's the question we have to again and again answer our investors. We're still confident about this space because of the need, the market size, the depth and the width, which allows for multiple business models, multiple companies to coexist and operate.
Okay, I don't think you've given yourself enough credit when you say you haven't done anything interesting. I think, when you look at something like a convertible, I think that's a very good path forward on the financing that allows some flexibility for an equity investor to come in, but still the investor gets to maintain control of his company. So you're a provider of financing, and Sandeep, you would be a recipient of financing. So I'd love to hear what you have to say as to what you think is the best way to finance the projects that you've done or your scale-up activities.
I'd just like to share our own story of how we landed on the model where we're at today. We didn't set out to do microgrids or mini-grids. We were just doing installations in every corner of Nepal we could find, of viable projects. We're trying to figure out how does the model scale. We did a rural installation in a very in the remote western part of Nepal at a hospital. This hospital was funded by an NGO, and it was providing pretty much free services with very modern technology like ultrasound, et cetera, and they needed power. And so we went out and put together a 12 kilowatt system at that hospital. And it was all paid by the NGO in one lump sum. So we were happy with that transaction. There was no financing problem. Yet, the community around the hospital didn't have any access to power. And it's really from that experience we sort of asked the question to the hospital, say, hey, if we put an extra 5, 8, 10 kilowatt at the same, in the same building where a hospital is, wouldn't you be happy to sell that to the community around, and we'll do some revenue split sharing, something like that? And they were very excited about the idea. So that sounds really great. It's, very innovative, et cetera, et cetera. But then they said, what, if you want to do that, don't do that with us. We can't be your partner. And we were very surprised. Why wouldn't you be our partner? What's the reason? And they said, well, as an NGO, as at the hospital we run, everything we provide is for free. So if you associate yourself with us, the community will expect that electricity to be available for free. And so it will not work for you. And so it's a simple lesson. It's the optics of how you set up the project, how you present it to the market is so much important. So we ended up trying to find other hospitals, other opportunities like that. In fact, we put together a whole team whose whole job was to go look at census data, look at villages over Google Earth about population density, how close the houses were, et cetera. And we identified 35 different villages where we felt like we should go visit, collect the data, put together financial models so we can go back to investors. And our threshold was, look, the banks in Nepal, they lend anywhere, commercial banks, anywhere from 10 to 14% interest rate. That's the lending rate in Nepal. And the loan terms are usually 5 years. You'll be lucky if you can get up to 10, but that's typically where it stands. So we felt in order to make these projects interesting for investors, our projects have to give a 15% return over 10-year tenure. And we felt if we could devise rural microgrid projects like that, it should be, impact investors should be happy with that. Something like that. and we went out to these villages, looked at all the numbers, and it was very hard to make it work. I mean, we were using solar technology. These were off-grid sites, so we had to use battery. And so the cost of installation was quite high, and then transportation was pretty crazy because most of these places you had to walk 2 or 3 days. And the only way to get the goods over there was either by helicopter or somebody had to carry it on their backs. So when we did the math, our IRR was like negative 2% at, around there for most of these villages. And we're scratching our head like, should we even be doing this? In fact, Santosh, where were you at that time? Man? We could have used your help. So where we're at today with rural microgrids is that was a lesson for us, saying, you know what, you cannot do rural microgrid in the traditional way. So only look for those type of loads that have a productive use where electricity could be converted into money directly, and that chain makes the project more viable. Second, don't just sell electricity. Sell some very basic needed services in that community. So that's where we're looking at making a package of electricity plus rice mill, electricity plus dairy chilling center. In fact, all our systems, because we need remote monitoring, we put an internet connection on there. So how do you monetize that internet connection? By providing services as telemedicine or mobile banking, as a paid services. So that was another way of making the numbers work. And again, all we're trying to do is get to that 15%. And even with that, we found some pretty good sites. And that's when last year ADB came to our rescue. They were a very great partner saying, you guys are pretty crazy going out there trying to develop this on your own. You guys do need some help, technical assistance, whatever. And with their help, they helped us qualify those projects further. And we selected 3 projects, 3 villages as our pilot site. And I'm very happy to announce that ADB has committed a $100,000 grant to help us with that pilot. It's a 35 kilowatt 3-village pilot. So in this financing model, what we've done is the village community itself is making an investment. So not the entire community. There's like 4 or 5 people who stand to benefit the most because they are the ones who are running the businesses, the rice mill and dairy chilling center and what have you. So the total project budget is $240,000. There's 5 or 6 investors from the local village who are putting $35,000. We as a company, we deferred our revenue, a portion of our revenue, so that we can at least cover our cost, but so that we can come in as a partner who makes our money over the course of the project. And then, additionally, we're going to take some bank loans. So we're trying to work with the bank to see if we can qualify that village as a deprived sector. So instead of getting a loan at a 10 or 14%, it could be more like 5 or 6%. And so that's an ongoing process. And the one thing that we did is I think is going to be quite interesting, and time will tell how effective it is that any grant money that's coming in, like the ADB's $100,000, we're treating that as an equity investment made on behalf of the community, the general community. So even though the general community didn't put any money themselves, but a big part of ADB coming in is because of the energy access issue. So what we've done is any dividend that will be earned by that equity, we're not going to be handing out cash to the individual community members because that becomes problematic, but we're treating that as a fund, a CapEx fund, that goes back into system expansion and also keeping the tariff rates low over time. Because the projects that we've defined is that we're only looking at a 10-year term. That's our goal. 10-year term, all the investors, community investors, ourselves, we get our money back and hopefully make some return over that time. But that system's life is 25 years. And so the dividends that come as a part of the grant fund will be used as a CapEx fund. So that's how we've structured this thing, and we're pretty excited about that. And looking at the metrics that are going to be coming out of this project, we hope to expand it to other 35 that we've identified. This is a business model. This is the financing model for the larger ones. There's, of course, ones where, if you're eligible for government subsidy, which in this case we were not, then you could have a different model. There's also very specific models around productive use, but those are more clear-cut when you're basically looking at one anchor load who's going to be consuming all of the power. That makes all the financing work and also absorbs all the risk of distributing that energy to the individual households. But I think this model we've developed with ADB, that's the one we're very excited about going forward.
That's really excellent. I like how you again go back to the economics about what's sort of viable, what's not, and trying to make it into what Anu talked about, is that this is more than electricity supply. This is really about social enterprise, but other services that you provide with electricity. Thanks for the plug on ADB, but let me be clear, nobody needs to come to me about grants. This is not what the private sector operations group does. We'd actually like to take our money and invest equity into your business, which would allow us to do more projects in the future. So just a warning to anyone here. I think maybe I could ask Marcus, I think you've been looking at where there has been sort of a blending of public and private funds along these same lines, and I'd be curious what you have to say about where that source of financing might be available for mini-grid development.
Good question. I asked that question myself too. So, well, on the one hand, just to elaborate first on one further point which I find important, which is that we need to be clear about risks as such. And I think if you define risks, well, according to the different part of the value chain of mini-grids, and you try to calculate them, and we are carrying out these days a study on that, and just to see what are the risk premiums. I mean, if you're more clear about that, you will be more clear towards DFIs, you will be more clear about donors, and also to the private sectors first to see or to let them understand why they should engage and what kind of risk they are taking. And it becomes even more important if we want to get more engaged with the finance sector as such, who is, I think, eager to engage, but still does not see the critical mass for this market, and they want to see, well, some reliable data. So also on this point, if there are any lessons learned you would like to share with us to put together on the assessment of risks, on mini-grid assessment, I will be very pleased to take that up into our study. The second point is, as you say, well, how to deal with co-financing and how to deal with DFIs and donors. What I understand, for example, as we are based in Brussels, that the European Commission looks very closely into how they can, on the one hand, have an active part in the co-financing, but on the other hand, how they can engage more in, well, in a sort of equity investment. I think that was just explained also by you, which is on the one hand, I think there are two models in place. The one is like that there will be public money available to be put into mini-grids if there is some positive return that could be put into the well, operating costs, or in the end that the company would well, grow out of or would pay back this, well, with the income achieved, they would pay back the equity, so really to take full control in the long term of the company itself. And I think this is a very interesting approach too. It would allow, on the one hand, well, the company to build up its own independent situation, autonomous situation, while at the same time the money paid back to the DFI, to the, well, to here in this case to the Commission, will let them allow to invest in other projects in the future. I mean, it all needs to be further elaborated as well. I think this is also, well, I'm very nice to hear about your case here, and I think this is a very nice lesson which we can share there. I was not aware of that one, and I think if we could elaborate altogether more on these points to see in how far we can, of course, reduce, on the one hand, the level of activity of a public sector, which is still relevant, as said earlier, but at the same time, as resources are limited, and the real scale we want to achieve is only possible by private actors and also by private finance, that we see how we really can phase out these public donors in the short term and to bring in the money from the private sector.
Thanks. Tripta, you want to comment on the financing challenge?
Well, I think I want to make the broader point that it's important to match the right kind of financing with the right kind of business model. So for example, when Sandeep is talking about the kind of financing that he's looking for, or when Anu is talking about what kind of businesses that she looks for when she is looking to finance, I think that the example that I gave, for instance, The financing for that particular example is mostly through grants. And so it's grants by international organizations like GEF or UNDP. And even once they transition out of those grants, what they're looking at is raising money through CSR initiatives or through a revolving fund. So I think that that's an important component of the financing aspect as well.
Yeah, that's a great point about CSR funds going into this sort of development. And I think there was actually an announcement recently that India is now looking at putting together some of its public entities, some of its big oil companies, and saying you will use your CSR money to be putting into off-grid energy ventures in India. So that's a good point about bringing CSR into as a source of financing. Santosh, would you like to comment?
So I'll start with the comment that Don made was typical lending models and looking at the sector. First thing I would say that the typical lending models of the traditional investments done in infrastructure or large energy projects do not fit here. So somewhere we have to take a call that whether we are too strict about the typical lending models and not willing to innovate there because this sector demands. The second point I would like to make is that we talked about number of sizes in this mini grid sector, and that range from 1 kilowatt to 7 megawatt. This huge spectrum with very kind of different you can say clusters existing on this spectrum. If you look at the financing spectrum, this is 50,000 USD to 10 million USD spectrum, but the clusters do not match. So you would say that the money is available, but it does not match the right kind of requirement. So in GIZ India, we did a large study where we looked at different segments within renewable energy space and the financing landscape available, particularly to that segment, and whether their risk return profiles, investment needs match to that. And we saw that there's a huge gap. A lot of segments were completely uncatered. So one thing would be to just take a very nuanced approach of the whole spectrum and see where there is a large gap that exists, and probably what kind of financial products financial institution can cater to that. I would also quickly touch upon a few financial instruments that are available in abundance and some are completely missing. Equity is flowing pretty well in most of the segments. What is lacking is working capital. Working capital sometimes also jeopardize the whole equity investment. And the entrepreneur is completely clueless what to do now. He has the equity, he has to scale. For scale, you require working capital, and the working capital, either it's coming at a very high cost, or the mainstream banks are completely not going there, right? So that's another thing. Third thing, the market development cost and the grants can be very well utilized. They can cater to each other. And I think I would really say that it's a great thought from you to use the grant as a community equity. I think it's a fantastic approach, a financial innovation that would really augurs well for a number of things here if properly done. But a couple of points, we look at the working capital requirements and the kind of financing available. And the one tool that is available to half of the spectrum of mini grid and not understood by the rest of that. That's the convertible debt or mezzanine finance. Most of the small entrepreneurs, they don't even understand. When they look for financing options, probably we can in this room debate about that, what are the financing, we can talk about very sophisticated financial tools, but if you go to the real entrepreneur who is operating a 5 kilowatt or 10 kilowatt plant, he is not even aware that this can be an option. So education on that, or the financing community need to go there and be very clear that, okay, our jargons might not be easy for you, but we can help you understand that. So I would really summarize that there are a lot of variation in the sector. The similar kind of variation and flexibility need to exist in the financial landscape.
That's great, thanks. I think the point you make about us talking about convertibles and mezzanine financing is very, very true. And this is a problem ADB has had, is where we've tried to do some mezzanine financing. We're not having a problem telling it to the entrepreneurs. We're actually having trouble explaining it even to public financiers that sit in this room who don't quite understand what the instrument is. And And again, it's just a challenge of trying to find the right instrument for the right scale of the financing. Okay, we've done a lot of talking up here. I'm hoping that there's a lot of burning questions. I know some of you may be already thinking about lunch, but the doors are locked. Nobody's going anywhere until we get 5 good questions. And I know enough of you that I will call your names if I don't see some questions coming up. I'm looking at you. I'm looking at, where's Pankaj is there. John's there. Does anybody have any questions or comments for the panel? Over here on the side.
Yeah, I've got a question combined with a comment. You were talking about financing. Actually, in the mini-grid sector, we need to finance infrastructure. Like we finance in grid extension, we finance large co-power plants or renewable energy plants. There are structures available to finance co-power plants, grid extension, these kind of things. On the other hand, it is well known how to finance solar home systems, which is rather like a sales business. Now we are somewhere in the middle. Like we have very small infrastructure, which does not fit into the project finance of the large grid extension procedures. It does neither fall into the sales business of the solar home systems. So what we need is something new, something in between the sales finance, like working capital, what we all talked about, and the project finance from the grid infrastructure. So what do you think about this? Like, how can we get in the middle of those two? I don't see any instruments right now. There are some banks trying to set up something, but I don't see any solution right now.
Okay, who wants to take that question?
As an investor, what we view is that for the sector to mature to a stage where it can be an infrastructure investment, it's still not there with mini grids. What we mean when we say infrastructure investment is that as an equity investor, you come in at a stage where there's execution risk, whether the plant will be set up in time and it will start running in time. And then once it starts, there is a steady cash flow, which is when you can sell off your stake to another investor who's looking for a long-term steady cash flow. So it's based on this long-term steady cash flow that traditional project financing, debt or infrastructure equity investments happen. Unfortunately, mini grids today are not at that maturity stage simply because the steady cash flow has to come from customers. Not a single entity with whom you can have a power purchase agreement for 25 years. You're dealing with customers. So that's the service model of selling every month to a single customer and collecting from them. So until your business is established or a single power plant reaches a maturity stage where you have a customer base providing you a track record of steady cash flows, we cannot do an infrastructure kind of investment. The second aspect is that it's not a single utility, you're dealing with multiple small utilities. So if we have to look at infrastructure level, a type of investment in it, then each of them have to be standardized such that as an investor, when we look at existing power plant, we know that the 81st or the 90th power plant that you set up will operate and function exactly the same way as the first, second, third, fourth. This kind of a track record we still don't have. This is why we believe it's an immature industry in which you need more equity investors or grant investors who can take the initial risks of developing the infrastructure, developing the business model to the stage where we can now say, yes, it's ready to be an infrastructure investment like it should ideally be. So that's where impact investors like us come in, and because we understand this, we believe we can invest and bring it to that level.
Okay, thanks. Do you have some more questions? Yes, here in the middle. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have a couple of questions sort of related. to the folks who come from the private equity world. In the United States, as you know, there's a very well-developed market for private equity investment, and also there is a very well-developed secondary market. So a lot of the investors who come in and as part of the first tranche of investment, they're driven more by tax credits and a lot of other things, and then they eventually exit, and there's a secondary market that buys this. So if you're making a private equity investment in UP or Nepal or someplace else, what is your timeline, generally, that you're looking at? And what is ultimately the exit strategy for that investment? Thank you.
This is the most difficult question to answer. But when we started, we said we would look at a 5 to 7 year timeline. We still believe 7 years is sufficient for an investor like us, unless we time our entry into the companies. So if we, the maturity at which we enter the business is very critical for us for defining the time frame. Because the theory again on exit, what we have realized is really practical, is really possible as an exit is to sell to another equity investor. Because for the company to grow to a significant size where it can even acquire, get the interest of a strategic investor or say the go to primary markets, the time frame is quite long. So we're looking at being the initial investor who will get them to a time or a maturity stage where there's still more value to be added by another private equity investor, where they could still take it to a much larger size that could attract more significant strategic investors or more significant capital. So actual time frame for a private equity might be much longer than what funds like us would be comfortable investing in. But we are looking at it more like passing the parcel or a relay, where we take in the initial risks at a certain stage and then sell it off, do a secondary to another private equity investor. This is at least the theory which we are working, and we are seeing some traction in some, we have seen exits in this manner in the microfinance industries and in few other sectors. We see the same for energy as well.
You want to add?
So just to quickly answer to that, there are, I think, 5 exits in renewable energy space in India, and all have been through secondary buyer, another equity coming into the picture. And primarily because if you look at the infrastructure kind of financing here, 15 years, you talk about mini grids, microgrids, and solar, the break-even period is very, very long. And as Anu highlighted, 5 to 7 years was difficult to get that kind of value.
Certainly. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry, you want to go ahead and add, Sandeep?
Yeah, just a quick point. There's also different kinds of mini-grid investment, and at least the way we've qualified is there's rural microgrids and then what we're calling business microgrids. And rural microgrids by themselves, it's hard, it's long. For us, it's 10 years right now, the way we're developing it. We hope to compress that time. There is a class of projects we develop, which we call business microgrids, which is a business campus. So it's not microgrid in the traditional sense because it's still single off-taker. But there you have a business, a large-sized business who's running a large diesel generator set, and we're going in as augmenting that diesel generator with solar. And so to basically get the cost of their diesel consumption down, their diesel uses down. Now in those, there's technologies where you can integrate with a diesel generator without using storage. They already have the transmission lines. They're already by the good transportation. So in those cases, it's feasible to get around to 5 years. So I think to lump them all in one sort of mini-grid camp, again, doesn't make sense. So you have to be aware of that.
Good. Thanks.
I'm Nauraj Dhakal from AEPC, Nepal. When we discuss about this business model and financing, I want to ask a question with the panel. If you see from the financiers or the bank's perspective, investors' perspective, because they have their own conventional way of doing business and they have the requirements set by this, that, let's say, for example, 3 years the profit and income ratio and all those things of the companies and this and that. So, and looking at this sector, this is kind of new sector. There are a lot of new players coming in, and the loan size may be also very small. So in that case, how and in what modality you can define the parameters that fulfill the financer's perspective so that they are ready to invest in this sector? Because ultimately, if they are not convinced that their money is going to be paid back, they may not put the money into this business. Thank you.
I'll quickly share our experience in Nepal. You know, the rural microgrid that we're doing, that we're going to be implementing with ADB, for that, we face a number of challenges. I mean, first of all, in Nepal government doesn't have a policy for microgrid subsidy, at least for solar. And you know, there's subsidy for solar home systems, other things, but not for microgrids. It's not in the rule book. And you know, our friends at the government, they were very cooperative in saying like, hey, look, we appreciate this idea. We're willing to work with you, but the work end result will not be a subsidy. It'll be more towards developing a policy that'll provide subsidy for later projects, but not for your project. So the immediate need was not achievable with government subsidy, but maybe down the future we hope so. So our only option was to get the remaining funds from the bank. Banks in Nepal also don't do project financing in the way internationally or in the international standard markets is the way it's understood. So they can't look at projected cash flows. They can't look at project assets. The rule book from Nepal's central bank is that there has to be physical collateral, i.e. land, for that project. So, you know, despite having our friends from bank come with us to the site and help everything, and they were really cooperative, they basically at the end of the day said like, look, we can't do this unless there's some land available. So the only way we could solve it was we have local community investors in this particular project who are also going to be using their land as collateral to get that loan. So that's how we solved that issue. Now, I'm sure there's a few things that we may have overseen. There's probably other financial instruments that as an entrepreneur we don't know, and we took this decision, but that's how we did it.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad also you got to say those sort of negative points about the bank and not having ADB to say it. But that's very similar to things we've discussed with Nepalese banks. Again, not just Nepalese, but even in other countries dealing with renewable energy is this issue of collateral. And I think it is one of the critical constraints about raising debt financing for these types of projects. We have two more questions. I have one here, and then I have one more in the middle. So those will be the last two, hopefully.
Hello. Yeah, I'm Alok from DFID. So I think one of the points that Santosh just raised, that the awareness at the entrepreneur's level is required to understand about different financing mechanisms, but also some kind of awareness at the financing institutions, so that they differentiate between project finance and the balance sheet finance, as you are saying. So that's one thing. And second, what I was thinking is that commercial lending would be really important to scale up. And few years back, India, the Reserve Bank of India, they came up with the guidelines that off-grid should be priority lending sector. But still, there has not been any investment from commercial lending side. So what developers or equity investor, what they think that could be levers for getting more commercial lending involved, in the sector, guarantees, mezzanine, or what kind of structure. So if you could highlight something on that, that would be useful. Thanks.
Santosh?
So I'll give an example which Anu highlighted, microfinance industry, and probably earlier question of risk also. So what we really need to have from the financing institution side is the recalibration of their risk perception of the sector. A lot of risks perceived by financing institutions are unnecessarily magnified. This is a very good precedence in microfinance sector. When sector was emerging, none of the risk departments of bank agreed that without collateral loan can be returned. It took 10 years to get the risk parameters out of the bank's assessment. Now they all agree. So as Anu pointed out, the sector is pretty new. We need to prove a lot of risk perception wrong twice or thrice. Until the time, the bankers were also saying that, okay, we perceive this risk, but there have been several instances where we have been wrong. Unfortunately, the sector being 5-6 years old and commercial lending just trickling in, it will take some time. So I don't think there can be instrument design, but designing instruments requires much more committed approach from the financing institutions saying that, okay, we see this sector emerging as a huge market. Now we are going to recalibrate our strategy to finance this. The new instruments, new risk perception mechanism, new kind of lending approach. Unfortunately, I might be proven wrong, but I don't have any precedent that some bank has already taken this step.
Yeah, and I'll even go one step further and say this is the sort of role for DFIs is to help get out there with commercial banks in these markets and actually do some training and technical assistance and trying to break down those risk barriers. And we've done that in energy efficiency to some extent and also with solar energy lending. But I really think that's the role for ADB and other DFIs to really get out there because if you don't capture that commercial bank market, then it's still going to be a huge deficit on the debt financing side. I think we'll just leave it with one more question to the gentleman over there in the middle.
Thank you for the panelists. I have short questions about this. If we go through in the microgrid, basically in the hydro-based micro, we can see the more cost than for the distribution than the generation cost. And is there any practice or modality in the panelist knowledge that has practiced to segregate the cost for the generation and distribution so that the distribution cost might be subsidized from the government or came as a grant, and then the generation cost could be capital cost which seeks the recovery in long run. So that will be helpful to have to make sure the micro hydros to run for a sustainable way. Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone want to take that? Have we seen a separation of costs or some sort of blending? Yeah.
So I don't have any example in micro hydro, but I know of one instance in renewable energy like mini grid. In India, I think my colleagues from C Kinetics and Tara, if they are in this room, they are trying out a model where generation cost and distribution cost are completely different. So there are two different bodies taking care of that. So that you might catch hold of them and then probably get more clarity on that.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, the microgrid that we're doing with ADB, most of the cost, the ADB's grant was based on helping with the generation cost, which is with the distribution cost, which was to lay out this long transmission line in these villages because the population is not as dense. And even after the technical assistance, the technology consultant team from ADB, when they came by and looked at our design, they said, well, not only that design has to be improved so that it's grid quality, because when the grid's extended, that transmission line is ready to support the national grid, but that also meant a higher cost for us. So, from a cost per installed watt perspective, that project looks kind of crazy, and I kind of hesitate to share those numbers, but it also includes that not only the generation cost, but also the distribution cost, but also thankfully, ADB was also, stepping in to help with their grant to build that. So I think your point is very valid. Those should be two different cost categories, and maybe over time, those also the job of two different EPCs.
Well, thanks for this. I think this has been very useful to talk about some different types of business models and financing. I know that I've learned actually quite a bit about some different things I hadn't thought of before. Hopefully you as well. I think first we should thank our panelists who provided some excellent comments on this subject. And I think it's, as I mentioned, it should be lunchtime. There should be lunch available in the upstairs dining room. And I think we would probably start back at 2 o'clock. I'm looking at the organizers, 2? No? 1:30? 1:30. So 40 minutes for lunch. Thank you.